In 2025, I was only 8 years old, and my world was small but safe. My mom, Lauren Smith, just won a seat as a California state representative. She was a force of nature. Navy veteran with a sharp mind and an even sharper sense of purpose. To the public, she was a rising political star. To me, she was just Mom, the woman who could conquer both Congress and bedtime stories with the same calm authority. That year, everything changed. California's wildfires were relentless, devouring whole neighborhoods in their path. Our home, nestled on the outskirts of Sacramento, became one of the casualties. I remember the night the flames came. The acrid smell of smoke burned my nose long before the fire trucks arrived. Embers danced in the air like fiery snowflakes as the heat pressed against my skin. My mom's voice cut through the chaos, strong and commanding, as she barked orders to neighbors and first responders alike. But for me, it was all a blur of noise, light, and fear. That's when I saw him. I was separated from my mom in the confusion, wandering through the haze with tears streaking down my soot-streaked face. Suddenly, a man appeared. Not a firefighter, not a neighbor, but a stranger. He looked to be around my grandfather's age, maybe in his mid-50s. His face was both weathered and kind, his sharp eyes somehow piercing through the smoke. Without a word, he knelt before me, wrapped me in a thick blanket, and guided me away from the inferno. His hands were strong yet gentle, and his voice, when he spoke, carried an odd calmness. "You'll be safe now." I clung to him as he led me to safety where emergency workers took over. By the time I looked back, he was gone. I searched the crowd desperately, but he vanished like a ghost. My mom never mentioned him, and neither did I. How could I? It sounded absurd, like something out of a dream. For years, I kept that night locked away in the recesses of my memory, unsure if it really happened. I never saw him again, at least not for a long time. By 2027, my mom's star was rising faster than I could understand. She won a Senate seat in the midterms and was already making waves in Washington. To me, the grandeur of it all felt like stepping into a movie I didn't fully understand. The halls of the Capitol stretched endlessly, a maze of polished marble and murmured conversations. I hated the stiff suits and the constant flashing of cameras, but I loved seeing my mom in her element, commanding respect with every word she spoke. It was during one of those ceremonies, a swearing-in event, that my world shifted again. The day was a blur of patriotic fanfare and solemn speeches. I remember the faint smell of polished wood and the rustle of expensive fabrics as senators and their families moved through the chambers. My mom just finished shaking hands with a string of officials when everything erupted. Gunshots rang out sharp and deafening. The sound tore through the air, freezing everyone in place. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it might burst. Security personnel swarmed the room, shouting orders as chaos unfolded. Someone grabbed my arm, a Secret Service agent, his grip firm but not unkind, and whisked me away to a safe room deep within the Capitol. The safe room was cold and sterile, its walls lined with steel panels that reflected the dim emergency lights. I wasn't alone. A group of other children, similarly wide-eyed and terrified, huddled together. The air was thick with the scent of sweat and fear. I clutched the edge of a metal bench, my hands trembling as I tried to process what was happening. And then I saw him. He stood by the door, his posture tense but composed. It was the man from the wildfire, or at least, it looked like him. His features were sharper, younger, but the same intensity burned in his eyes. My breath caught in my throat. How could this be? The man who saved me 2 years ago was much older. Now he looked barely into his 40s, as though time itself rewound. He scanned the room, his gaze settling briefly on each child. When his eyes met mine, a flicker of recognition passed between us, though neither of us spoke. An older boy, maybe 15, approached him, his voice shaking as he asked, "Can you help us?" The man stiffened, his hand twitching as though resisting the urge to reach out. "Stay calm," he said quietly, his voice steady but laced with tension. The boy stepped closer, and for a moment, the man's calm facade cracked. He recoiled slightly, as if the boy's proximity burned him. I couldn't look away. There was something inexplicably familiar in the way he moved, the way he carried himself with quiet authority. My mind raced with questions, but I couldn't bring myself to ask any of them. Fear and confusion rooted me to the spot. The lockdown eventually ended and we were escorted out one by one. By the time I worked up the courage to look for him again, he was gone. My mom hugged me tightly, her voice soothing as she reassured me that everything was under control. But I couldn't shake the image of the man who wasn't supposed to exist. He was there that night, protecting us, just as he was during the fire. And this time, I was certain. Something far bigger than I could understand was at play. By the time I turned 14 in 2031, life at the White House became my normal life. My mom, now in her third year as president, managed the pressures of the Oval Office with the same unflinching resolve I always admired. But her success came with risks, and those risks became clear the day I was nearly kidnapped. The morning started like any other. The West Wing buzzed with its usual rhythm, aides whispering urgently into phones, the faint clicks of heels on marble floors, the distant hum of news reports echoing from TVs mounted in every corner. I was supposed to attend a press event with my mom, something about an environmental bill she was signing, but instead, I convinced my Secret Service detail to let me explore the gardens alone. The crisp autumn air smelled of freshly turned soil and the faint sweetness of decaying leaves. I wandered between the hedges, enjoying the rare moment of solitude. It felt like the calm before a storm, and I had no idea how literal that would be. I barely reached the fountain when a van screeched to a halt outside the South Lawn gate. Men in dark clothing poured out, moving with alarming precision. My heart sank as I realized they weren't tourists or protesters. Before I could react, two of them vaulted the fence. My security detail shouted commands, their voices sharp with urgency, but the men moved too fast. One grabbed me by the arm, his grip bruising and cold. "We have the target," he barked into a concealed earpiece, dragging me toward the van. Panic surged through me, hot and suffocating. I thrashed and kicked, but his hold was unyielding. The world blurred, the flashing lights of the White House windows, the distant yells of agents, the metallic clang of the van door sliding open. Then, out of nowhere, a figure emerged. He moved like a shadow, swift and deliberate. It was him, the man who saved me during the wildfire and again during the shooting. This time he looked even younger, his face smooth and his body leaner, but there was no mistaking him. His eyes locked onto mine for a split second, and something in his expression shifted, a mix of determination and regret. With practiced precision, he disarmed one of the kidnappers, twisting the man's wrist until the gun clattered to the ground. The other turned to face him, but before he could react, the man delivered a swift blow that sent him sprawling. He pulled me to my feet, his grip firm but not harsh. "Run," he commanded, his voice low and urgent. I hesitated, my legs trembling beneath me. "It's you," I whispered, barely audible over the chaos. "You're the same." His jaw tightened, and for a moment he looked as though he might say something. But instead, he pushed me toward the approaching agents. "Go now." The Secret Service swarmed the scene, their weapons drawn, their movements sharp and coordinated. I stumbled into their protective circle, my head spinning with questions. When I turned back to find him, he was already gone, like a phantom retreating into the shadows. Later, as I sat in a secure room surrounded by stern-faced agents and a visibly shaken mom, I couldn't stop replaying the encounter in my mind. This time, there was no doubt. It was him, the same man, yet somehow younger. Who was he? And how was he defying the passage of time? These questions haunted me long after the incident. I tried to bring it up with my mom, but she dismissed it as the ramblings of a scared teenager. I couldn't blame her. How could anyone believe what I'd seen? But deep down, I knew this wasn't the end. The man's presence in my life wasn't a coincidence, and sooner or later, I would find the answers. By 2035, I was 18 and headstrong, grappling with the weight of expectations that came with being the president's son. My mother, now deep into her second term, carried the world on her shoulders, and I carried the burden of her legacy, at least that's how it felt. I grew restless within the gilded cage of the White House, its opulence and security a constant reminder of how little control I had over my own life. That night, I slipped past the watchful eyes of the Secret Service and into the sprawling cityscape of Washington, D.C. The air was heavy with the scent of rain-soaked pavement and gasoline, and the streets pulsed with the energy of nightlife. I met up with a group of strangers, their laughter loud and carefree. the kind of recklessness I desperately craved. Drinks flowed freely, and I let myself get swept away in the haze of neon lights and slurred conversations. It wasn't until we stumbled outside, the cold night air biting against my flushed skin, that I realized how far gone I was. One of the strangers, a tall guy with a tattoo snaking up his neck, suggested heading to another party. My head swam as I tried to follow their chatter, my legs unsteady beneath me. Just as I was about to climb into their waiting car, a voice cut through the fog of my drunken stupor. "That's enough," the man said, his tone firm and unyielding. I turned and saw him, the same man who had been a phantom in my life, appearing and disappearing without explanation. This time, he looked to be in his early 40s, his face lined with experience, but still strikingly familiar. He stepped between me and the group, his presence commanding enough to halt everyone in their tracks. "Who the hell are you?" Tattoo Neck demanded, his words slurring with intoxication. The man ignored him, his focus solely on me. "Mason, you need to go back. Now." Anger flared in my chest, fueled by alcohol and frustration. "Why do you keep showing up?" I slurred, my voice cracking. "Who are you? Why do you keep getting younger?" His jaw tightened, and for a moment he looked as though he might say something. But instead he reached for his phone and dialed a number. Within minutes, the flashing lights of a black SUV approached, and my Secret Service detail appeared, their faces a mix of relief and frustration. As they escorted me back to the car, I twisted in their grip, shouting over my shoulder, "You know, don't you? You know what's happening to you." His expression didn't change, but his eyes, those deep, knowing eyes, held a glimmer of sadness. He gave me a single nod before turning and disappearing into the night. Back at the White House, I tried to explain everything to my mom and the agents, but my words came out garbled, my thoughts a jumbled mess. "He's going backward," I insisted. "He's getting younger every time I see him." They chalked it up to drunken ramblings, and maybe I couldn't blame them. But in the silence of my room, as I stared at the ceiling, the weight of that man's presence pressed down on me. He knew something he wasn't ready to share. And for the first time, I realized that this wasn't just about me or my safety. It was about something much bigger, something I was only beginning to glimpse. The White House glittered like a jewel against the winter night, its grand halls alive with music and laughter. Guests in sharp tuxedos and flowing gowns mingled under crystal chandeliers, raising glasses of champagne to toast the end of my mom's presidency. It was the last Saturday before the new president's inauguration, and the gala felt more like a farewell celebration than a political gathering. My mom's usual composure softened into warmth as she greeted old friends and dignitaries, her laughter a rare melody that I hadn't heard often in recent years. I wandered through the crowd, my formal shoes pinching slightly with every step. The polished floors reflected the lights in a golden haze, the air thick with the mingling scents of expensive cologne and hors d'oeuvres. Somewhere in the background, a string quartet played a waltz, their music weaving through the conversations like an elegant thread. "Mason," my mom called as I passed her near the grand staircase, her hand lightly brushing my arm. "There's someone you should meet." She guided me toward a tall man standing near the fireplace, his back to us as he chatted with Speaker Melissa Garcia. When he turned, my breath caught in my throat. It was him. But not the version I seen just months ago. This man looked no older than 25, his hair neatly combed, his eyes sharp and alert. His posture was confident but relaxed, and a faint smile played at the corners of his lips as he listened to the speaker. My mom's voice faded into the background as my heartbeat thundered in my ears. "Mason, this is Aiden Garcia," she said, beaming. "He's Speaker Garcia's nephew and a national hero. His code-breaking skills helped end the Beijing War." Aiden's gaze shifted to me, and for a split second something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, perhaps? But his expression remained composed as he extended his hand. "It's an honor to meet you, Mason," he said, his voice smooth and steady. "But we've met before," he said. "We have?" I asked, with my heart almost destroying my ribs. "Yes, when we were kids, we were held in the same safe room as the house shooting in 2027. Then I did remember him. He was the older boy who asked the man, who was somehow also him, if he was going to protect us. I realized he held his hand out, and I forced myself back to attention, and shook his hand. The warmth of his palm sent a jolt up my arm. "You too," I managed. "It's good to meet you too." It became obvious that the POTUS and Speaker of the House had bigger things to discuss, so I looked to him. "Aiden, would you mind if we spoke in private for a bit?" I asked. "Of course," Aiden replied, his smile widening. "It's not every day you get to meet the first son." As I followed Aiden toward a quieter corner of the room, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was an elaborate dream. Before I could ask him anything, a rough hand gripped my arm, pulling me into the shadowed alcove of a side hallway. My pulse spiked as I turned to see him. The older version of Aiden, now in his 40s, his face lined with years of experience and burden. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low and urgent. I glanced back toward the younger Aiden, still standing by the fireplace and completely unaware of what was happening. My head spun, the impossibility of it all crashing over me like a wave. How are you both here?" The older Aiden's grip loosened, his expression softening. "He doesn't know yet," he said. "And he can't. Not now, not for a long time." I stared at him, struggling to find words. "Why? What's going on?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's complicated. I've been protecting you for years, Mason. From threats you can't even imagine. And yes, I've been moving backward. In time." "Why me?" I asked, my voice breaking. "Why do you keep saving me?" He hesitated, his eyes searched mine. "Because you're important. More than you know. But you'll understand when the time is right." Footsteps echoed nearby, and he stepped back into the shadows, his figure dissolving into the dim light. Moments later, the younger Aiden appeared, his expression curious. "Mason, you okay?" I nodded, forcing a smile as my heart raced. "Yeah, just got lost for a second." He chuckled, the sound warm and inviting. Every glance was borderline flirtatious. "Happens to the best of us. So, what did you want to ask me?" I swallowed hard, my thoughts a tangled mess. "Tell me something interesting about yourself," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. But I was finally able to mirror his bold flirtations. Aiden's eyes lit up. "Well, I've just been accepted into a NASA program. If all goes well, I might be one of the first humans to set foot on Mars." Despite everything, I found myself smiling. "That's incredible." His eyes caught me, and he knew the meaning behind my gaze. "It is," he said, his grin infectious. "But it's going to take years of training in Florida. Not exactly glamorous." "Do you believe in time travel?" I asked, my voice lighter, almost teasing. He laughed, the sound genuine. "It doesn't sound absurd like it used to, but I'm pretty sure it's impossible." I smiled, my heart still heavy with unspoken truths. "I don't know. I guess time will tell." I smiled at him so there would be no mistake where my imagination was. "I'm glad we met, again," he said. "Me too," I said. And in that moment, in that smile, he looked the way he did when he was a boy and an older man. I couldn't fully know what the future held, what obstacles we would have to overcome. But I knew one thing for sure. Our story was only beginning.